Tonight, we are delighted and honored to have with us Hawa Allan, celebrating the publication of her new book titled Insurrection, Rebellion, Civil Rights, and the Paradoxical State of Black Citizenship. It is published by W.W. Norton. So Hawa Allan is an attorney and an author who writes cultural criticism, fiction, and poetry. She is a lecturer at the New School and an essay editor at The Offing. Her work has appeared, amongst other places, in The Baffler, Chicago Tribune, the LA Review of Books, Lapham's Quarterly, and also Tricycle Magazine, where she is contributing editor. Joining her tonight in conversation is Pamela Sneed. Pamela Sneed is a poet, educator, and performer. She is, of course, no stranger to City Lights, and we had the honor of publishing one of her books, Funeral Diva. It is great to have her back. She is the author of 3 additional books, which include Sweet Dreams, Kong, and Imagine Being More Afraid of Freedom Than Slavery. She was a visiting critic at Yale University and at Columbia University's School of the Arts, and is online faculty at Chicago's School of the Art Institute teaching human rights and writing art. She also teaches new genres at Columbia's School of the Arts in the visual department. Her work has been widely anthologized and appears in Nikki Giovanni's The 100 Best African American Poems. She makes her home in Brooklyn, New York. Please join us now in giving a warm welcome to our evening's guests, Hawa Allan, Pamela Sneed. It is such a great pleasure to have you both gracing our virtual halls. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Hawa. So I'm really happy to be here with Hawa Allan, and I have to say that I think the book is is incredible. I think it's really important. I think it's really timely. And I keep wanting to go back and forth and read and reread, and I was telling you earlier that there were points that I wanted to stop and cry because it's just painful, some of the history that's kind of brought up. And one of the things that came up for me, a lot of different things came up for me. Well, one, when you were talking about slavery, right? So this whole book is centered around the Insurrection Act of 1807, yes? And so we're gonna come to that. But one, you talk a lot about slavery and how we came to have this act enacted in America, right? But so one of the things that came up was the Royal African Company, and I haven't heard that name since basically I guess I was doing my MFA, and I was doing a piece on the slave trade, and it was called Right to Return, and I'd done some work in Ghana and on Cape Coast Castle, and then I was researching the castle, the slave fort, and came across the Royal African Company, and they basically were enlisted. They were, in Europe, and they organized. They were basically the slave traders, and a lot of them were just these British guys who literally left their families and they just wanted to go to the continent and have sex. And I mean, it was just so disgusting, right? And basically a lot of them never made it out of Africa. They died of pox or alcoholism, but it didn't matter. They were going to Africa to have this, they left their families, so that they could have this sex, and, and if they could make some money too, bringing back slaves, and that was great. And so anyway, hearing the Royal African Company again, I was like, oh yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, so I mentioned that in the context of John Locke. That was the first chapter of the book, where I basically just set up, this dynamic in which we find ourselves living in the after effects of, the definition of someone as enslaved, and as, of white citizens as, by association free or relatively free, and that sort of dialectic and that tension between these two categories of people. These legal categories that again then created cultural and social categories and economic categories. But so John Locke, the intellectual forefather of the Declaration of Independence, in his theories, he said to enslave someone is essentially to declare, is to make a declaration of war. Because once you enslave someone, you inevitably are igniting the inalienable right that person has to their own, freedom and their own liberation, right? So it was interesting, of course, in mentioning this and mentioning someone like John Locke and, going into the Declaration of Independence and whatnot, these sort of, sort of historical documents and figures I discussed, I made a point to add in a parenthetical that Locke was a shareholder in the Royal African Company, because I wanted to, because there are all these sort of asides that at least I'll speak for myself, that I feel like I have in my head when I'm reading through, and researching some of this history, particularly with those figures like, John Locke, and of course, founding fathers who were slaveholders, where you have to sort of put aside these contradictions in between what they claimed to believe in and what they professed and what their actions were. And I was trying to make it a point to, as much as as much as possible, to sort of put that in the forefront, or at least not ignore these contradictions as I went through that history. So what was interesting about Locke as well, so on the one hand, he made that statement that to enslave someone is to make a declaration of war, which I thought was useful in setting up this dynamic where, essentially there's been this ongoing and bloody battle to, since that moment, to fully incorporate Black people as full citizens of the United States. And it's been this sort of warlike contest, right? So that lock-in statement sort of helped set it up. But what was also interesting is that he also had these theories that help establish, private property, and the sort of theoretical underpinning for private property. And essentially he said, like, if you go into the commons or the state of nature, and you sort of cultivate it or do something or manipulate it in some way, then you've essentially staked your claim of ownership to that, particular parcel of land in that example. And then I made an analogy between, that statement and this idea of, how one could potentially, at that time, theoretically, say that slavery, was consistent with that theory of private property. And that was essentially sort of taking the enslaved person, the supposed barbaric, African-born person, removing them from the state of nature, right? And then sort of cultivating or taming them into, someone who, or a person or a being that was supposed to be sort of working on behalf of the enslaver, right? So, and in that case, the work or the labor that was performed in order to convert, under that theory, right, to convert, a person into property was violence, right? No one's gonna voluntarily just become enslaved. You have to actually, brutalize them, and then thereafter maintain that ongoing threat of brutalization in order to sort of stabilize that sort of degraded status that you have, forced them into.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of questions about that too, because, we're talking about like how they were able to establish slaves and slave states, and basically by turning, human beings into things and all of that. And then we have that same phenomenon that still exists today, And so this idea of like objectification and dehumanization. And then you say something too, which almost made me cry, which was unfree freedom, and I haven't heard that term before. And it was just like, I don't know, I just had to put the book down at that moment. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what we've gotten, unfree freedom. But so I wanted to go to the first question, which is many first have heard of the Insurrection Act when Donald Trump threatened to invoke it last year in response to the George Floyd uprising. But you've been thinking about it long before that. So how did you first come across the act?
Well, so I came across it when I was trying to figure out just for myself, like what was the reason that there was such a, a long sort of period of delay between, the disaster in New Orleans and Louisiana brought about by Hurricane Katrina and the federal response, right? So we all remember George W. Bush and Kanye and, Kanye saying, he doesn't care about Black people, and Mike Myers was, you know, like aghast, like on that sort of, I think there was some sort of televised fundraising program. But behind, so like behind that delay, I found out
Mhm.
was a tussle between George W. Bush and the governor of Louisiana, because she had requested federal assistance through something called the Stafford Act, which, through that there could be like military troops, like federal military troops or additional National Guard troops organized through the federal government and that, the executive branch, um, and they would be sort of, on a search and rescue mission. They wouldn't be allowed to make arrests or, engage in search and seizure or do any of the things that like local police forces could do. Um, but George W. Bush wanted to deploy those troops pursuant to the Insurrection Act, which would allow those troops to engage in those very activities, right? It's like the one of the limited, um, exceptions to this overall blanket rule against using military as, local police force. And he
Right.
claimed he wanted to do that because he was hearing after Hurricane Katrina hit, the communication systems were down, and that's a situation that's rife for the proliferation of rumor and exaggeration. And in that case, particularly with a mostly Black population in New Orleans, there was this exaggerated like false, it turned out, um, talk of, excessive violence, people shooting for people from rooftops, like there was these pedophilic rape in the Superdome, which was like a makeshift shelter for people. So there were these exaggerated rumors of violence, and those rumors were not just perpetrated, by lay people on the ground. I mean, they were repeated by Mayor Ray Nagin at the time, the governor of Louisiana herself, who ended up arguing with George W. Bush about whether or not to invoke the Insurrection Act. She also, in response to these exaggerations of violence and these rumors, was talking about how she was looking to borrow National Guard troops from nearby states, and they had M16s that were locked and loaded and they're ready to shoot to kill. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric she was engaging in right after a major natural disaster in which people were suffering, drowning, and waiting for real help, right? So in any
Right.
event, I found out that the Insurrection Act was sort of behind all of this. In the end, Trump did not invoke it in response to Katrina, but the delay, he claimed, was largely due to the back and forth with the governor, because the governor wanted to be the commander in chief of the response. And if the Insurrection Act were invoked, then George W. Bush would have been the commander in chief of the military response. So it was like this weird federalist battle they engaged in, and I guess the people were collateral damage to that, back and forth.
Well, okay, so then my next question is like it kind of like skips ahead and then we're going to go back. But okay, so Donald Trump, most people have heard of like the Insurrection Act when he like threatens to invoke it, with regard to the George Floyd uprisings, right? So again, it's like, I'm going to like, call in the National Guard to, to kick these, Black people down, right? And then, we have the Capitol 6, the Capitol riots on January 6th, right? And basically no Insurrection Act, no nothing. He didn't even call it so again, there's this big racial discrepancy. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but that's something that comes to mind. Do you want to say anything about that? Or
So basically with Trump, because again, it was funny because I was thinking about the Insurrection Act, writing about it, and then Trump threatened to invoke it all of a sudden in response to the George Floyd uprisings. But that invocation happened to fit in perfectly with the pattern that I had uncovered when I looked more into the Insurrection Act. I was trying to figure out when else was this used, why haven't I heard about this? And in looking into it, I was sort of, astonished to find that there was this, first of all, there was used in all of these events that in African American history that are sort of iconic. Number one, like including, the after the certain cops were acquitted in the wake of the Rodney, associated with the Rodney King beating, the LA riots, 92. Before that, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, there was an Insurrection Act invocation in Baltimore, Chicago, and DC. And then before that, it was used in response to the Detroit riots of 1943, 1967. And then even going further back, I mean, there are other sort of instances, but, just to get us, before the 1900s, it was used in response to, it was used in order to sort of suppress the violence that occurred in the territory of Kansas, and the tussle over whether or not it would be a free state or a slave state. And it's a battle that is referred to now as Bleeding Kansas. And there was one military historian who associated the Insurrection Act with the put down of the Nat King Rebellion.
Right.
Sorry, not Nat King. What am I talking about? Nat Turner.
Daniel.
The Nat Turner
Yeah. Oh,
Rebellion.
okay.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So that could have been among the first invocations. But so that's this sort of pattern where you see a sort of like in the 1900s, you see there's a use of the Insurrection Act to suppress so-called race riots, and maybe before 1900s, you see it associated with these sort of battles against slave powers, in those, at least in those two instances. But then you have this other side of the act, and people will remember the desegregation of public schools, where you had troops standing by as Black students were walking in, to the Little Rock Nine, right, in Arkansas, or James Meredith trying to register at the University of Mississippi, right? So in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama, there were Insurrection Act invocations in order to desegregate public schools. And also,
right. Are those the only times that like the Insurrection Act was like used on behalf of Black people, like as opposed to,
Exactly. So one
right.
more, it's the Selma to Montgomery March. So that there was an Insurrection Act invocation in order to protect the First Amendment rights of the civil rights protesters to march from Selma to Montgomery. This is all after the Bloody Sunday, conflagration and the clash and the brutality on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Then the Insurrection Act was invoked in order to sort of facilitate a march after that.
So how did you get involved with the Insurrection Act? Like, how did you, come to want to write this book? Like, what's the journey? What's the trajectory?
Well, so once I saw that pattern, I mean, I was in the throes of writing a legal article about it, because I figured that, it merited some kind of discussion, because I was very invested in the Hurricane Katrina aspect. But then when I saw this pattern, I felt like it deserved more further discussion beyond just like the law and how it had been used, specifically in those cases, but also to think about it as a reflection of Black citizenship, and how, the fact that there's this extraordinary power that the president has in the context of the Insurrection Act, to domestically deploy the military, right? I mean, that's something that's a very, to deploy the military in order to suppress civil unrest specifically, that's a very extraordinary power. And the fact that it was, used, largely in response to this sort of Black-white racial divide, to me, I felt like there needed to be a way to talk about this beyond the law itself, but in a way that brought in culture and how society is shaped by these laws, and how Black citizenship, like there seems to be this sort of precarity about Black citizenship, notwithstanding all the progress that we've been making.
Wait, so is it Mitch McConnell who said today that Black people vote like other American citizens, or like, yeah. yeah, like other American citizens or something, but it was like Black people were not being referred to as citizens.
Right, exactly. Well,
Yeah.
that, I mean, and I mean, that is exactly what is sort of coming out here. There's this idea of, Black citizenship is, of course it was an oxymoron at the founding. That very statement was an oxymoron at the founding of this country. But, despite the formal entitlements of citizenship, there's still this sort of instability and like this sort of battle that continues to happen in order to sort of really fully realize that citizenship. And it's, we all, we just went through Martin Luther King, Jr.'s birthday, the holiday. And I think, we're all used to these sort of sanitized portrayals of progress and, ways in which this history has been sort of whitewashed. And I felt like the Insurrection Act in particular, it draws out the violence that was sort of, implicated in realizing, Black citizenship incrementally over time, which I think is
Wow.
very important to do.
Huh. Yeah, I had another question, but I forgot. But okay. So you also consider the notion of progress alongside these famous events in African American history, an attempt to reconsider it in light of the Act's invocations. Can you say more?
So in terms of this, war, right? We started off with like John Locke saying to enslave someone is to declare war. And then we have these Insurrection Act invocations over time, which show a sort of warlike battle, with respect to, Black citizens, enjoying, the full entitlements of citizenship and full participation, in the sort of, quest to attain the American dream. So, I mean, I think that's really like, I was like in the book, actually, the first half of the book, there are two parts of it. The first half, I kind of put under this umbrella term called progress, and I do put it in quotes. My editor told me that sounded somewhat snarky, and and I agreed. But I said, we need to keep this in quotes because
Right. And you say that like, history is more cyclical than progressive, right? And
exactly,
I mean,
it keeps turning around, right? Like in
right,
the
right,
second half,
right.
it's called time loop for that very reason.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And I think that, history is the way that it's been told. And I've written about this, that we have this idea of like, north to south, one straight line, you know what I mean? And then you're free. Right. And
Mhm.
so you never really get a sense of like, I guess my analogy was, well, what if you get trapped in the woods? You know what I mean? And you're wandering around for a really long time. Like we're just not prepared for longer battles, right? Like thinking about, like I often think about Mandela,
Mhm.
and how long, that journey was. And I
Yes.
mean, it wasn't just him, he was a figurehead for a lot of people, right? But we have a generation that's like not really prepared for a longer fight. You know what I mean? If we're
Mhm.
continuously told that, it's instant line, clap and you'll be there. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Rub your
Like
feet
the
together or
Emancipation
something.
Proclamation, and then slavery. Yeah, exactly. There's these
Yeah.
sort of very. I mean, I keep using the word sanitized, but I guess it's just simplistic and, like you said, linear, right?
Right. Right.
Where there are these advancements and then there are retrenchments, right? And then
Right.
obviously there's cycles, and there seem to be like once you get to the next plane of freedom, there's another version of the battle that's the same part of the core battle from the very beginning. That's where it comes from, but it's being played out in a sort of a different realm, so to speak. It's like playing a video game. You go to the next stage of the video game, but you still have like the same monsters, maybe like with different like some
Right.
fire in different angles or something, but it's the same. It starts to seem very repetitive, and I felt like in the second half,
Right.
which basically starts off, largely once we start getting to the 20th century, what I was hoping to do was to sort of illustrate how certain themes that arose in the first half continue to play themselves out, right? in notwithstanding the fact that the scenery is different, the people are different, right? The time is different, but the themes sort of continue, right? And we're still battling with these themes.
Well, I had like a couple of things because I remembered what I wanted to talk about. But one, something that I had, thought about, because you talked about like Mike Brown and what happened with him. And one of the things that I wrote about Mike Brown was that his life had more value in slavery than it does now. And like, and the thing is that in slavery, they didn't want to destroy property. That was like, that was the last, that was the what is it? The last outcome, the last choice, right? But now it's like, we're not even like being valued as property. So it's shoot to kill, right? So that like, he had a better chance of survival in slavery. And so, I mean, how do we talk about that? It's like,
yeah,
so, yeah.
Because like so there was one law that I quoted in the earlier section of the book. It's the part where I talk mostly about slavery and sort of set up, this ongoing tension that we find ourselves in through the, lens of the Insurrection Act. But in that they actually, with respect to this law, there was this idea that, it would be hard to sort of impute negative motive to an enslaver who killed an enslaved person, their slave, right? Because why would they want to destroy their property, right? So it was a way in which, like the mens rea for like committing like a murder, right? Like maybe first degree or whatever the different degrees are. There's a way that was like considered in the context of the incentive to keep your property alive, right? It's exactly what you're talking about. But now you fast forward and we're in the Mike Brown stage. But what's interesting is that the discussion about property shifts, obviously, because now, the Black American is no longer property, but now they, in their, unfree freedom, become a sort of threat to property, whether as, someone who is seen to be stealing it or, committing arson or, vandalizing it in the context of a riot, or someone who's moving into the neighborhood of a white, citizen, right? So there's a way in which the protection of property discussion changes, at that demarcation. But there's still like an impulse to protect property, but obviously it shifts once
right now protect property from the Black people. right yeah, I was also thinking about like I was thinking about bell hooks, and having lost her, recently. And I was just, I was like thinking about you as a cultural critic, and I was like so excited, that and then also I feel like I'm in the realm of cultural criticism, and also so you have like a lot of like personal anecdotes, stories that like kind of go along with just talking about this law, and in a way it makes the reading like interesting. It kind of like takes it out of the realm of like just theoretical, but makes it much more tangible. And so how did you kind of do that? How did you infuse this what you've learned like kind of as a lawyer or as a theorist, and then also imbue it with like sort of stories and anecdotes?
So that was interesting how that came about. So my editor, Elaine Mason, she was the one who suggested that I write it in this hybrid style, because I had been writing things in hybrid styles already, but it didn't really occur to me necessarily to do that with this, largely because I was wondering, like, how am I gonna, talk about this act and then infuse some sort of personal narrative, so that it became a challenge. And it was one that I was excited about, but it was also one that, quite frankly, I did not know how I was going to do. That said, what ended up being really useful in sort of inserting these anecdotes and making them fit and not making it seem so disjointed was looking at the themes that arose in each sort of chapter. So each chapter I talk about, sort of different events, usually, with the Insurrection Act incidents sort of anchored in there. and then I sort of interspersed them with this other kind of commentary. But I found that there was like a way in which certain themes arose. Like in the first chapter where we were talking mostly about slavery, etc., the theme was fear. The fear of slave insurrection, right, amongst white citizens, and then also the fear of an enslaved person, right? I mean, all this talk about fear. I mean, who should be the person who's the most afraid in this scenario, right? But somehow, like, this discussion about fears always ends up being outsourced in these discussions to the wider white society, right? And these fears of retribution or revenge, for these essentially these sort of atrocities that are being committed upon people. But there's also the fear of the enslaved person. I mean, and in the end of that chapter, what I really liked about that was sort of interspersing that history with this discussion of basically the master slave dialectic that Hegel put forth. And without getting into it too deeply, the end of the discussion was that an enslaved person was really the one who had this deep fear, but then it was transformed into courage in order to rise out of that situation. And this was something, I think, like they were saying that Hegel, when he wrote the master slave dialectic, he might have been thinking about the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
So, I mean, they're saying that could have very well have been on his mind when he wrote that sort of small piece. But this idea is like how does one transform that sort of deep-seated fear and well-founded fear into courage, and the courage you would need to rise up. And I think that, like, when you fast forward to today, we're still dealing with these fears, right? The fears of the wider white society with respect to the Black and or brown person. But then, I mean, what about our fears, right? And dealing with this sort of hostile society. Like, these usually, it gets underplayed, I think. And we're supposed to be these strong warriors.
Right. And I mean, I think it's an important point because, like, we've been so dehumanized, that we aren't allowed, like, a response, right? We aren't allowed any kind of human feelings. And so, like, I mean, I'm thinking about like 12 Years a Slave. Like, I'm always like looking at like our depictions, right? And there's a young woman, she started in Pariah, but she plays the slave on the plantation, and she cries the whole time. And then they said, the mistress says, get that slave off the plantation. She's depressing the other slaves, right? And it was like the first acknowledgement that I had ever seen in a film that somebody was depressed, that a slave was depressed. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's funny, but it was just like, it was the first time we ever got like a human feeling, you know what I mean? She could not stop crying, which would be a natural reaction to the
her predicament. Exactly.
Right.
I mean, and you can even fast forward to this idea that, in terms in medical procedures where there is a stereotype that Black people can withstand more pain and are therefore given, less sort of anesthesia or even less fewer, painkillers or whatever it is. And even their professed pain in the context of being a patient is undermined and often ignored, So these things, these issues sort of seep into the everyday, and I think it's important, like, to sort of when the personal and the historical is sort of juxtaposed, to sort of bring that out in a more, just to bring it out and to really, instead of saying the after effects of slavery and like all the things that you might want to say, it's like, let's illustrate it, and then we can show it, not for anyone's particular consumption, but just for our own sort of
to be able to acknowledge pain, our humanity. I mean, even at the end of that film, again, like, the first thing Solomon Northrop says, in Steve McQueen's script is just, is he says, "I'm sorry." He apologizes to his family, And it's like he was enslaved, you know what I
Mhm,
mean? And he just
mhm,
went through this horrible ordeal. And the first thing out of his mouth is, I'm sorry. And I just thought, I mean, again, there are moments, I wasn't like a big fan of that film, but there are those two moments I think were really profound because, again, we've got to express something human that has never
mhm,
really been depicted, you know?
mhm,
Um, so I was thinking about that. And then I was also thinking about, it kind of ties into about like we're always being portrayed as reactionary. Like we're never like, because I would like I analyze film, right? And so I was like
mhm,
looking at like Queen and Slim and again, like any kind of activism, like they wiped out any like intellectual component coming from Black people, and Black people do this as well, you know what I mean? So then it's just kind of like we're only in reaction, to
mhm,
what white people
mhm,
do or to what the law does or anything like that. And it's like we're not thinkers, like we have no sense, we don't ask any questions, we're just, we just respond, and it's
mhm,
kind of
mhm,
like that's not true, and
mhm,
so they take away like our sense of like reason, you know what
mhm.
I mean? Like, and you talked about that when you were talking about like anger and stuff like that, and like we have a lot of reasons to be angry. And then if we express, and then if we
Yes,
express it, it's like, oh my God, what's wrong with you? You know what I'm saying? Or look at that
yes.
hooligan or something like that. Yeah. It's just
And
my
it's like,
thought.
because it's like the feelings, and that's the other thing, is that, especially when you're talking about something like history, or if you want to, fast forward to now and say race relations, right? There's a way in which, the feeling, the emotional content and the emotional motivations of behind a lot of what is going on gets drained out of the discussion. And then you're just
Right.
talking as if there's some sort of rational sort of, you know, uh, progression of events occurring, but really the rationality is an overlay on top of this, all of this, heavy, deep emotional content that is continually being navigated, and I felt like it wasn't an act, well, not an accident, I didn't do it on purpose, but I felt like it was perfect that when I was drawing out these themes, many of them had this emotional content, like fear, cognitive dissonance, um, anger, right? Like, and how
Mhm.
these emotions either drive situations or are suppressed in certain ways in order to navigate these situations. And I feel like the personal narrative kind of makes that come alive, certainly a lot more. But and
Mhm.
then it makes it easier to connect that to the legal history that's being excavated, and see like how they're the reader can sort of make these connections.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I thought I was the only one that was working in this hybrid form. And then, like, oh, everybody's working in this, not everybody, but I was just like, oh, yeah, I think, people make you feel like it's an anomaly, but it's like, it's not, and you
No,
do
I
it
don't think
really
so.
well. And it makes the book accessible, in a really important way. And so, I mean, I have a lot of different questions, but I wanted to ask if you would read like a section and
Sure.
yeah.
Okay. So this section is from chapter 1. The subheading is called Black over White, and you'll figure out who I'm talking about as I read. Okay. This is a personal narrative section. I was a summer associate at a New York law firm that had been bombarding its wide-eyed recruits with a sufficient variety of amusements to distract us from how dull the work was. I had danced around purchased tables at exclusive clubs with champagne flutes in my hand. I had been waited on by waiters who waltzed in synchronized movements around our dining table. I had watched Avenue Q. One afternoon, I was invited via group email to the top floor of the building to hear from a candidate for Senate. A partner had been supporting the Senate Hopefuls campaign and was helping him raise funds. So I took a break from researching a very dry memorandum and shot up in the elevator to check it out. After a brief introduction and tepid applause from the gathered audience, the candidate stepped to the front of the conference room. I remember listening to standard fare for a political address as the speaker promised what he would do if elected, his words weaving some nearby future that all of us in that very room could help bring into existence with our combined civic and financial efforts. What stood out most in my memory, however, is his emphasis on his heritage, which became a refrain of his speech. My mother is from Kansas, he kept saying, and my father is from Kenya. The candidate was eventually interrupted by the partner who had invited him to speak. New York law firms all had personalities, I'd been told. This one, though relatively prestigious, was known to be a bit rough and tumble, or plainly full of jocks. Accordingly, this man who had been made partner found it fitting to inform the audience, head shaking and hands waving in the air, as if preventing a bar brawl, that this man right here was the only candidate who could bring together the voters of Illinois behind a progressive platform. This partner should know, after all, he was from there, and as he knew, it was rare for the voters he was familiar with to rally behind a progressive, much less a Black. A Black? I remember asking angrily, rhetorically. A Black what? A Black shoe? A Black dog? This is what I asked later that afternoon at another one of our scheduled amusements, holding hostage the sympathetic ear of a fellow summer associate. He listened intently, but appeared circumspect about carrying on the conversation. I couldn't blame him. Whenever I gathered with one or more other Black summer associates to chit-chat in the hallway, I would periodically crane my head to check for any disapproving onlookers and was always poised to disperse. In any case, right then, in the conference room, I remained silent along with everyone else and simply scanned the other attendees to see if anyone was visibly offended. The candidate was poker-faced, as the rest of us. After all, he was there to raise funds, and the rest of us were getting paid actual corporate salaries. He did, however, invite all of us to his fundraiser that night. Okay, I'll read one more section.
Yeah.
Later that workday evening, I entered a large event space where Barack Obama's fundraiser was being held. The event was sponsored by an African American Lawyers Association, one of many such identity groups convened to professionally encourage Black lawyers, who at the time comprised a single-digit percentage of all lawyers in the United States. We still do, only an estimated 5%. Black women make up only 2% of the profession. Though absurdly low, these statistics don't mean anything to me. If equality and diversity are truly noble goals, then they will never amount to any particular number. Having spent a lifetime accustomed to being the only, or at most, one of the few Black people in any given room full of white people, I never believed that having more of us there would do anything other than cause alarm for everyone else. Given the widespread assumption in the United States of a white majority, there is an implicit threshold tolerance for diversity. Up to said threshold, my majoritarian hosts might view my statistical presence as an extension of benevolence, a reflection of their tolerance and good nature. And after this tipping point, my presence would be a threat. I attended the fundraiser by myself, drawn by promised networking and the guest of honor. There were hors d'oeuvres, drinking, and sporadic dancing before an MC ascended to a spotlighted stage and hushed the crowd. When Obama finally came to the microphone, I didn't necessarily expect an ovation. I didn't really have any expectations at all, having just heard him speak that afternoon. But I ended up being very surprised. I stood there and listened to him give the same exact speech that he'd given earlier that day, with one exception, and that was inflection. My mama's from Kansas, and my daddy's from Kenya. He said everything I'd heard before, but in African-American vernacular English. He code switched.
Yeah, I love that. I love that section. And I mean, that could be a book in itself too, talking about Obama and his presidency. And and I talk about what is it? Halle Berry does that too. You know, like in terms of her depiction of like Black women. It's just like, who is this, right? You know, they're from like, I don't know, like, I mean, and I actually wasn't the person who like who noticed it. It was like all these white critics were talking about the film, and they were like, you know, her depiction of like I guess a welfare mother is so down and out and so destitute, like this kind of like Southern inflection, and it's like, where are you from?
Where are you from?
Right. And what is your idea of what Blackness is? And so, and again, I bring up Obama too. So I want to ask one more thing, and then we're going to switch to the Q&A. Okay. But so, okay, the word insurrection is now a household colloquial term. What is your view about the recent usage in light of the January 6th events?
So as we know, you can't turn any on any television or look at your phone without hearing or seeing the word insurrection. And what is new, at least for me, is particularly having been delving into this research, is the fact that this term, is being sort of applied with respect to the activities of a mostly white crowd. The stormers, the Trump supporters who, breached the Capitol building. Now this is with some exception. I'll get into that in a second. But what was interesting is that having looked at all of this history and then having this, January 6th event happen, was that when, even when, the Black citizens, or, were being, their rights were being protected under the Insurrection Act, like the desegregation of public schools, March from Selma to Montgomery. In terms of the presentation of the people involved, it's like it was the civil rights protesters who had that sort of image or like stigma of the sort of rebel or the insurrectionist, even though it was the state officials, the Southern state officials, who were breaking the law, violating their constitutional rights, and were not implementing, Brown v. Board of Education, or in the case of Selma, the federal court order that, sanctioned their First Amendment, the civil rights protesters' First Amendment rights to march across the, march to Montgomery, right? So you have these figures like George Wallace, they become notorious over time, but, in that context, he was really the insurrectionist, but what we have instead is like this televised image of the, mostly Black civil rights protesters as the ones being disobedient, right? That's the civil disobedience. Yes, they were breaking state law, but ultimately, state law was actually not valid, right? So they weren't really breaking anything. They were just asserting their actual rights. So now we have this context where you have this mostly white mob, and you're calling it an insurrection, etc. And there's this, ongoing debate, like, yes, it was an insurrection. No, it wasn't an insurrection. And I think it has to do with this sort of this unfamiliarity with that label being attached to, the people who were involved, in the event, and I think that's where that comes from, because as we've been having this conversation over and over again for the last certainly year and a half, 2 years, like, and as your chapbook, as you mentioned, like, if they were Black, right, they wouldn't have to do anything. I mean, yes, those people, they were kind of like yahoos, and you can say that they look kind of confused and they were taking, selfies. Some were more violent than others, right? But we had this sort of mixed picture of like, they looked like, they just look like
clowns.
Yes, exactly, like streaming out of a sports stadium or something. But if you were Black and doing that, right, it wouldn't matter what you were actually doing. Your actual
it would have been a
presence would have been
bloodbath.
threatening. Exactly, because you wouldn't have had to do anything to be seen as a threat, because the historical sort of imputation is already on you regardless of your actual actions, right? So that's what's interesting about it. And the one caveat that I was going to mention is that, there was an Insurrection Act invocation in 1871. This is by Ulysses S. Grant. This is towards the end the end third, I would say, of Reconstruction, and it was invoked in order to suppress the Ku Klux Klan's sort of extra legal terrorism, essentially, because they were that's when they sort of arose and started running rampant in parts of the South, and they're really causing a lot of instability. And Southern officials sort of appealed to President Grant to help, restore law and order in that context. And then that led to the passage of the Enforcement Acts, one of which was called the Ku Klux Klan Act, and that a lot of those the aspects of that legislation was focused on, suppressing the Klan. Right. So we do have that, there is, that sort of precedent around that time of Reconstruction, but nonetheless, I think that it's still sort of a rare occurrence where you have that term, particularly one that in the antiquity, in the antebellum time was colloquially usually associated with the slave insurrection, now being applied to these sort of like mostly white sort of mob of Trumpers, which is it's been a narrative.
And it's also, it's a cover up, you know, and like everyone is participating in it, the media, you know, the government. I mean, because, you know, they looked like clowns, but they were dangerous. People died, you know.
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is, I mean, again, if they were Black, you know, they would have shut down Washington. Nobody would have gotten out of there, you know. And so it's just, I mean, and then like, look what they did to the Panthers, you know, and it's just kind of like, they didn't have files on them. They couldn't find them. You know, it's
Right.
like, what is this? You know what I'm saying? And so we're watching this huge cover up, and I've continued to write about it because I feel that it's so dangerous. And the fact that we're watching everyone participate in this cover up, you know?
Well, what's an interesting part of it as well, in thinking back in the history, like I was looking at, for example, the use of the militia, the predecessor to what we now call the National Guard, like the state militia, to suppress insurrections. And of course you had, you know, slave patrols, which were a little bit more organized, you know, you know, and then you had, obviously, state officials had their role in sort of this architecture of enforcement, you know, during slavery, and even afterwards, there was this sort of after effect in terms of these entities being used to surveil and police and you know, the movements of Black people. But you would see, it's, you know, when you compared like these sort of more formal entities, particularly, you know, the militia, or maybe certain, you know, government officials, you know, and the police, you would look at, you know, these characters, and then you would have the flip side, which would be like the KKK, right? Or these sort of extra legal sort of secret societies, you know, that would focus on sort of reasserting white supremacy, and how those members would be the same people, right? So you know, one minute you have the sheriff's hat on, the next minute you have on your hood, right? So it's like this sort of, these vigilantes, like almost like a sort of inverse of Batman or something, or maybe like a villain, you know, who has like two faces. And now here we are, fast forward, and you know, there's a lot of controversy around this, but you know, there's this talk about like, were the feds involved, right? And then to the extent they were involved, it's like we wouldn't even know in what capacity, because it could very well be sort of a replay of that aspect of the history, where there's a doubling effect going on, like in one role you're sort of like this sort of proper citizen, in this other role you are a vigilante, right? So I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, really powerful. I love this book. Okay.
Thank you so much.
I think it's really important. And so let's go to Q&A, unless there's anything that you want to just say in closing.
I mean, I just want to thank you for coming and talking to me about this book. I mean, this has been a really great, fun conversation. And I feel like you're like a great interlocutor to talk to, because of, you know, your work and your interests. And I feel like this is like, and then when you tell me that you like the book, I'm very glad, because I feel like you would be a perfect reader for this kind of book, you know? So thank you very much.
Yeah. So do we have some questions?
Yeah, it's starting to emerge. So Jerry says, I so understand Pamela is saying we have so much to be angry about. I think about this all the time. How in the world do you both manage your anger?
Well, I guess, I mean, for me, well, I mean, there are practical tips, right? I mean, I'm actually a very big meditator, so I'll just throw that out. I love meditation. I'm a very big self-care person, you know, but stepping outside of the sort of, you know, mundane practical tips, I will say, I mean, anger is not just a destructive force. It's also a force that is generative. And particularly one, and I mean, when you're angry, it means that a boundary has been crossed, right? There's been some sort of violation and you're responding to that, right? Or an apparent boundary, let's put it that way, because, you know, we're not necessarily perceiving things accurately all the time. But nonetheless, there's an apparent sort of boundary violation. And the anger is something, you know, it's meant to sort of instruct you to take action in order to defend yourself. right? So the anger is a useful emotion. It's one that it's it's evolutionary, right? We've evolved to continue to be angry because it was actually something we needed to survive. So the question is, what do you do with your anger, right? It can be destructive, but it can also be something that can sort of push you into some sort of action, and hopefully one that is, productive, right, in the given situation.
Yeah, I find that yeah, I mean, you just reminded me of Audre Lorde, uses of anger. And I mean, for me, I teach, I write, I paint, I have like a very, I sing, so, my life, my whole day is pretty much a creative one, and I try to, I try to inspire like my students to like be fighters, I taught a course like at the new school that I just proposed, and it was called what is it? At the Movies, Human Rights, Science Fiction, Horror, and Rise of the New Blaxploitation, and I asked the kids, well, what did you think of the course? Do you think it's important? They're like, yes, and like we won't settle anymore for like when people say, oh, it's not that deep, or don't look at it. And it's like, it is important, it is that deep. And so if I can inspire that, like I feel like a lot of my anger gets channeled, positively. But I also think that it's a problem for people of color, and I think that there's been so much repression. I mean, that's why all the illness and all the isms and all the things that we get is because of the fact that like we've been forced to suppress our anger, our emotions, everything, gaslighted into like subservience, told nothing is wrong with what's wrong with you people, everything's great, and yeah, so I mean, acknowledging your anger, being able to express it. And I mean, I have to say that I'm probably, now at this age and this time getting better about being, also, I mean, I think like as a woman, that's a whole other thing, like being able to express your anger as like a Black woman, it's like, oh, forget it, because people like women are not, in general, are not allowed to like express anger, and then forget it if you're a Black woman, so like owning those emotions, I mean, it's a lot of therapy. A lot of therapy and a lot of art and athleticism, and I also think exercise is really good.
So I'd like to put out something concerning narratives, because it seems that what we need is a kind of a restructuring of some grand narratives, because those who are supporting fascism in this country seem to have a kind of a visceral narrative that they have all kind of identified with. And, like the removing of the masks, being infected with COVID, I mean, willing to go to those extremes, very visceral extremes. There's a kind of a mythos behind this. And when I think about MLK and Gandhi, and I think about WTO and Occupy, there were narratives that emerged with those events. But what I'm wondering about now is we have social media now that didn't really exist before, so that in real time, activists can kind of readjust the narrative so that, the counterinsurgency that is, of course, most likely to come, can be dealt with in a very different way. Could you address what you think the narratives are that we should be thinking about, and maybe even the counter narratives?
Well, so this is, I like that, the fact that you use the term narrative. And that's something that I definitely do talk about in the book, because, we're living in narratives, right? And we create narratives of our own in order to make meaning of the world and to navigate through it, right? So we're constantly telling ourselves stories. We've inherited stories, we're being told stories by other sources, and then using those stories in order to sort of plot or advance, our way through life, right? And in terms of the looking at this history, what always struck me, and I've said this before, like in terms of as a student of history, like, in grade school and beyond, it's felt like names and dates and events and places. And I had trouble sort of connecting the dots and sort of, getting a meaning that's felt actually meaningful to me. And what I was really missing was narrative. And this is not obviously when you move on and you're like a PhD or something like that, then things start to become a little bit more nuanced, and the different narratives start to emerge, and they're contested. But at the more basic level, when you're just trying to figure out like what happened and when, I feel like there's a way in which the narrative is largely either removed, or you get this weird sanitized version of everything that sort of fits the sort of patriotic sort of model of how we're supposed to understand, the whole American project, right? So this book was really an attempt to figure out what I really felt happened from the perspective of a narrative, not necessarily all of the dates and places and all of that stuff, but like, how was I going to connect these dots, and what does that really mean to me? And I don't think I have like a grand narrative. I certainly don't have an elevator pitch narrative, but I think, my takeaway was that I feel like it's important for people to sort of engage with this history on their own and really decide for themselves, what they really think happened and how they fit into all of this, and like how they, their sense of meaning is being adjusted or transformed, and that's not something that, most people have the opportunity to do. And it's certainly not, the opportunity is not laid out in front of you in the sort of schooling systems and education systems that we currently are confronted with. So unless you decide to do this, it could very well elude you altogether. But as we see, we're now dealing with, we have the 1619 Project, which is sort of elevating the role of slavery in particular, and how, that was a sort of foundational moment in terms of understanding the United States. And then you have the 1776 Project, which is like talking about liberty and, the founding fathers and what their intentions were and how that's the real story, right? So, I mean, like those seem to be the two main narratives, at least in the context of like my, story, or what I'm talking about in the book. But I still feel like there's something a little bit too that's still, we need multiplicities of narratives, and we need
Right.
people to sort of engage with these narratives on their own and be more nuanced and decide how they fit into them,
Right.
and I feel like that's what's really most important.
Right. Yeah. There's an ongoing, I'm working on another book like right now, but in in Funeral Diva, I talk about being trapped in a story, and it's sort of like, it's humorous, but, and I say, I'm a mime and I'm holding up a sign, and I'm like, because I remember mimes can't speak, but I say, help, I'm trapped in a story, and I'm trying to scale the walls to kind of like get out of my own story. Right. And then in this particular book, I kind of follow up on that, and and I'm talking about like there's an addendum to being trapped in a story, right? And it's just like being in a theater, and not having a speaking part, right? And I guess what I'm interested in, like, well, I feel like the reason why your book is so important, Eric, Hawa, is because of the fact that you are like changing the narrative, and you do talk about that a lot, and also giving us information, that we don't necessarily have, that can empower us, to be able to speak about like, what is happening in our lives, you know what I mean? And like what's impacting us. So I feel like, yeah, again, like all this, like, new literature that's coming out, and there's still not enough. We need more and more and more, but I'm like really happy, for your book, and to see, at least now there's some choices, what I'm saying? But I've also been kind of like, consumed with like inner narrative, like in the sense of all of those things that we're not so aware of that we've internalized. I mean, I'm here in Jamaica, right? And it's just kind of like, again, thinking about like Marley. I mean, this is like silly, but when we're talking about like, mental slavery or emotional slavery, where all the chains have like the outward chains have been removed. And so really we're talking about what we've internalized, that we don't even know, but we're acting upon, right? And so in that regard, like, I feel like so much of my life now is not only just dealing with external chains, but like internal chains, just thinking about like the institutions of family and stuff like that. Like, I have like a really crazy mother, and talking to people, and they're like, oh, you must protect the family. And I'm like, it's just so interesting that people would defend the institution of family, not even knowing them, but to defend that institution. And that's something that we've internalized no matter what is going on. Do you know what I mean? And so in that regard, I've had to challenge a lot of like narratives because I've lived through that. And then it's like, what have I internalized as a belief system? And I'm also interested in like, not just like the outward, revolutionary, but I really want to engage with people who are internally revolutionaries, who are revolutionaries in their lives, who are revolutionaries in like their day to day. I mean, that, Hal and I live in like the same neighborhood. And I'm always like really excited to see Hawa because like I just think she's brilliant, right? I have a lot of respect, and I appreciate brilliant people who are like really who walk the walk and talk the talk, like I'm tired of like the hypocrisy, you know what I mean? Because you have a lot of people say, oh yeah, I want to do this, I want to do that, and we're just acting out all the same isms, you know what I mean? So like, years ago when June Jordan was alive, she first came to the new school when I was at the new school. And the first thing she said was, this country needs a revolution. And and she was right,
Yeah,
and so.
and it's especially what you're saying, especially I'm thinking, especially with social media, how they're, like you're starting to see the difference between acting like you care about something and actually caring about something, right? There's like social media has brought these issues home in a way where it's not enough to sort of vote the right way or have the right, thing on your lawn, the right sign on your lawn, but it kind of takes it kind of brings that mirror much closer, and there's this sort of running commentary on who you are on a regular basis, right? And I think that's I think ideally it would call us to sort of kind of turn that gaze inward as well, like you were saying, and really decide who am I really, like because am I really this person that I'm pretending to be online or that I'm appearing to be online? Is my are there ways in which there's a mismatch here, and in which I'm performing these narratives for social acceptance? I mean, like these aren't just existential questions. Like, these are like day-to-day issues. And I think the constant access to social media and like to everybody's like 5 thoughts, I think, is bringing this question home.
Yeah.
Well, this has
Yeah,
been
and that, yeah. Well, we've lost so many, just recently, so Andre Leontali, Bell Hooks, Greg Tate, Sidney Poitier, and like, I mean, these are all people who changed the world, and I, the only exciting thing is that I feel like, yeah, now it's time to level up, and like, and we've got to change it, and I feel like how you're doing that in your work, and I'm trying to do that in my work.
Thank
and
you.
So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank the both of you. This has been stimulating, thought-provoking, kick-ass talk. Really very, very grateful. Thank you, Hawa Allan, for writing this book, for joining us here tonight. Thank you, Pamela Sneed, for doing the honors and making an excellent interviewer. I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us. You always help complete the circle.
I want to say thank you very much for inviting me. And, this was a really lovely event. And I was very happy to that Pamela agreed to speak with me about the book, particularly at her home publisher. And I was saying, I didn't get a chance to say this, when we were in front of everybody, but, this is one of my favorite bookstores. And I've only been there once and I knew it right away, like, hands down, it's like the St. Mark's bookstore. It's like the sister of St. Mark's bookstore, but in San Francisco. I love it. So I was really honored that you, had us here to talk.